Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Miss Marple and the Poisoned Breakfast. Chapter 1. A Letter of Distress. On a crisp autumn morning in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, the first light of dawn filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's snug sitting-room. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp leaves and freshly brewed tea, a gentle reminder that even the smallest changes in nature could hold a secret, much like the peculiar events that often troubled her thoughts. Miss Marple, with her habitual calm and attentive eyes, sat in her favourite armchair by the window, lost in quiet contemplation, when the post arrived with a soft rustling of paper. There, among the usual letters and small parcels, lay one envelope that immediately caught her attention. It was neatly sealed and bore the distinguished handwriting of Dr. Edward Hargreaves, a local physician whose gentle manner and compassionate approach had long earned the trust of the villagers. As she carefully broke the seal, Miss Marple noted the precision of the handwriting and the deliberate choice of words, hinting at an urgency and concern that was not typical of routine correspondence. The letter began in a measured tone, yet each sentence resonated with a profound sense of distress. Dr. Hargreaves explained that a young girl had been arrested on charges so grave they sent shockwaves through the community, a charge of murdering her beloved aunt and cousin. The doctor's words were chosen with care, for he knew that such an accusation could shatter the delicate balance of a young life. "I write with a heavy heart," the letter began, "for I have witnessed in this gentle soul a kindness and innocence that contradicts the very nature of the crime with which she is now burdened." As Miss Marple read on, her mind began to piece together the subtle hints woven into the narrative. The doctor's description was imbued with both a clinical precision and an unmistakable warmth that betrayed his deep familiarity with the girl. He recounted how he had met her during one of her visits to the clinic, a meeting marked by her quiet demeanour and the soft, almost hesitant way in which she spoke of her family. It was clear that the doctor held an unshakable conviction regarding her innocence, and his concern was not limited to the facts of the case, but extended to the emotional toll that the allegations had inflicted upon her. The letter also mentioned that the girl had an extraordinary bond with her aunt, a relationship founded on years of care and affection. Dr. Hargreaves wrote of her aunt's gentle nature and the comfort she provided, a stark contrast to the sinister nature of the accusation. In his careful prose, he implored Miss Marple to lend her considerable talents to uncovering the truth, as he believed that the evidence at hand did not align with the character of a girl who had known only kindness and love. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled ever so slightly as she considered the implications. She had long held the view that the truth often lay hidden beneath layers of misinterpretation and circumstance. The letter, with its measured tone and subtle urgency, was a clarion call to seek out that hidden truth. It was not merely a plea for help from a concerned doctor, but also an invitation to unravel a mystery that promised to challenge the common assumptions of guilt and innocence. Setting the letter aside, Miss Marple rose gracefully from her chair and moved towards the window, where she gazed out at the familiar village scene. The gentle hustle of daily life continued unabated, children on their way to school, neighbours exchanging friendly greetings, and shopkeepers preparing for the day. Yet beneath this pastoral calm, the The prospect of injustice simmered like a secret waiting to be discovered. The details in the letter urged her to trust her instincts, for the fabric of human nature was often threaded with complexities that defied simple explanation. In that moment, Miss Marple resolved to follow the trail of clues that lay before her. The doctor's earnest plea had set her mind alight with questions. How could such an innocent girl be entangled in a web of deceit? Who might be manipulating the evidence to frame her? And most importantly, what hidden truths lay concealed behind the facade of familial affection? With these questions guiding her thoughts, Miss Marple quietly prepared to step out into the crisp morning air, ready to embark on yet another investigation where every detail mattered, and every small observation could lead to the unravelling of a much larger mystery. Chapter 2. The Doctor's Plea. Miss Marple arrived at Dr. Edward Hargreaves' modest surgery on a brisk late morning, the sort of day in which the sky wore a patchwork of gentle grey and silver clouds. The surgery, tucked away on a quiet lane of St. Mary Mead, was an unpretentious brick building that nevertheless exuded a comforting sense of care. As she approached the door, she was greeted by a cheerful young receptionist, whose warm smile and polite nod set a hopeful tone for the conversation to come. Inside, the waiting area was simple, yet inviting. Miss Marple took a seat on a well-worn settee, its fabric soft from years of use, and admired the quiet order of the room. There were framed photographs of smiling patients and shelves lined with well-thumbed medical journals. Soon Dr. Hargreaves himself emerged, a kindly man with a gentle demeanour, his round spectacles perched on his nose, and a modest air of concern evident in his eyes. With a courteous nod, he beckoned her to a small parlour adjacent to his consulting room, where a kettle was already on the boil, and a teapot steamed invitingly. "Miss Marple, thank you ever so much for coming," the doctor began as he poured tea into delicate porcelain cups. His voice was soft but firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seen many of life's complexities. "I must confess I felt rather helpless after sending you my letter. The matter is exceedingly delicate, and I find myself at a loss with the evidence as it now stands." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes twinkling with the warmth of shared concern. "Do go on, Doctor," she replied, accepting a cup of tea with graceful thanks. "I believe every detail, however small, might be the key to untangling a knot of injustice." Taking a slow sip, Doctor Hargreaves began to recount the particulars of the case with a measured tone. "You see, there is a young girl, so gentle and sincere, that has found herself ensnared in a most troubling set of accusations. The police claim that she is responsible for the poisoning of her dear aunt and her cousin. Yet, in all my years of practice, I have never encountered such a tender soul capable of harbouring such malevolence." The doctor's eyes softened as he recalled his encounters with the girl during her brief visits to his surgery. "Her manner is unassuming, her voice hesitant, and there is a light in her eyes that speaks of a deep affection for her family. In fact, she once confided in me that her aunt was the person she cherished above all others. It is this very love that makes the charges levied against her so utterly inexplicable." Miss Marple listened intently, nodding as she sipped her tea. She noted how Dr. Hargreaves' words were laced with both professional detachment and a genuine personal concern. "It seems to me," she mused, "that appearances, particularly those of innocence and tenderness, often hide more than they reveal. But in this instance, the contrast is too stark. A heart as pure as hers would be overwhelmed by grief, not driven to commit such an act." The doctor sighed, leaning back in his chair as he considered his next words. "I have observed that when a person of such character is placed under undue pressure, it tends to show in subtle ways, nervous tics, a slight tremor in the voice, the kind of pallor that comes from the weight of sorrow. Yet, when she spoke to me, I found none of these indicators of guilt. Instead, there was only a quiet sadness, a despair that spoke of being unjustly misunderstood. As Dr. Hargreaves spoke, Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, piecing together the layers of the young girl's story. "I have always believed," she remarked gently, "that truth often lies beneath the surface of our first impressions. It is a matter of looking deeper, beyond the obvious. Tell me, Doctor, did she ever mention any conflict or trouble at home that might have led to such a dreadful misunderstanding?" The doctor shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of frustration and sorrow. "No, Miss Marple, nothing of the sort. In her brief account, all she ever mentioned was the warmth of her aunt's love, the stability of the household, and her own quiet contentment until a sudden misfortune turned her world upside down. I fear that someone might be manipulating the circumstances, setting the stage for a tragic frame-up." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind cataloguing every nuance of the doctor's observations. "It is often the case that those who seek to benefit from misfortune will go to great lengths to conceal their true intentions," she said softly. "I trust your judgment, Doctor, and your conviction in her innocence. I shall examine every detail with the utmost care." By the time their cups lay empty, both Miss Marple and Dr. Hargreaves felt a renewed determination to pursue the truth. In the gentle clink of porcelain and the soft hum of conversation, a partnership was forged, a promise to unravel the tangled threads of a mystery that had ensnared an innocent soul. Chapter 3. A Visit to the Jail. On a brisk afternoon, with the autumn sun casting long shadows over the cobbled lanes of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple set out for the local police station, a sombre building that doubled as the temporary holding place for the young girl accused of poisoning her aunt and cousin. The atmosphere at the jail was heavy with muted voices and the occasional clink of keys, a stark contrast to the usual calm of the village. Yet Miss Marple's determined gait and gentle demeanour seemed to part the gloom as she approached the reception desk. Inside a small, sparsely furnished interview room, Miss Marple found the girl seated on a cold metal chair behind a set of barred windows. The girl's eyes, downcast and weary, revealed a deep sadness and a quiet resignation that tugged at Miss Marple's empathetic heart. With a soft smile and a few reassuring words, Miss Marple introduced herself and took a seat opposite the young woman. The light that filtered through the narrow window illuminated the delicate features of the girl's face, a face that had known little else but kindness and familial love. "Good afternoon, dear," Miss Marple began in her characteristically warm tone. "I am here to listen, if you care to share your story. I understand that this must be an awful experience for you." The girl's voice, trembling yet determined, broke the silence. I do not know where to begin. Everything happened so fast. I was living happily with my fiancé in another city when I received a letter from my dear aunt. The letter was brief, yet it carried such urgency that I could not refuse her plea. As she spoke, her eyes flitted nervously around the room, as if the cold walls might be listening in on every word. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, her keen eyes observing every subtle twitch of the girl's expression. "Please take your time," she said softly. "I assure you, your truth is important." Gathering her thoughts, the girl continued. "I arrived at my aunt's house with my fiancé filled with hope and concern. The moment we stepped into that home, I sensed a warmth, a promise of familial love and comfort. My aunt welcomed us with open arms, and there was also her daughter, who I had always admired, and a lady who was introduced as a close friend of the family. Everything seemed so normal, so kind. Her voice faltered for a moment as she recalled the unsettling details. But soon I began to notice things that did not fit with the picture of a happy reunion. My fiancé, who I had trusted with all my heart, appeared too familiar with my cousin. There was an intimacy between them that made my heart sink with doubt. I tried to dismiss it at first, convincing myself that perhaps I was overthinking things. However, the unease grew with each passing day. Miss Marple listened intently, interjecting gently. "And how did this make you feel, dear?" The girl's eyes welled with tears, and she clasped her hands together as if to steady herself. It was as though I had been cast adrift in a sea of betrayal. In a moment of despair, I decided to call off the engagement. I returned the ring to him, hoping that I could salvage what little remained of my honor. But the damage was done. I felt so alone. There was a long pause as the weight of her emotions filled the room. Finally she resumed, her voice barely above a whisper. "A few days after my heart was broken, I decided to prepare breakfast for my aunt and her daughter. I wanted to mend what had been broken by my sudden decision, to create a normalcy that I desperately craved. But that morning everything changed. After breakfast, they both fell terribly ill. Before I could fathom what was happening, I was overwhelmed by chaos. The police arrived, and in the confusion I was arrested, accused of having poisoned the very people I loved." Miss Marple's eyes softened with compassion as she regarded the trembling girl. "It must have been the most distressing moment of your life," she murmured. "To be accused when all you ever wished was to help. It is no wonder you feel dismayed." The girl nodded, her voice fragile but earnest. "I did not add a single drop of poison to that meal, Miss Marple. I am innocent. I never intended for anything so dreadful to happen." As the conversation lingered, Miss Marple noted the quiet sincerity in every word and the deep sorrow that seemed to anchor the girl's soul. There was an undeniable aura of honesty around her, a softness that did not belong to someone capable of such a heinous act. Yet the mystery of that fateful day remained shrouded in unanswered questions. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "the simplest truths are the hardest to discern, hidden beneath layers of misunderstanding and misfortune. I promise you, dear, that I will do all in my power to discover what truly occurred that morning." Chapter 4. An Unexpected Invitation. Before the fateful day that would unravel her life, the young girl had been contentedly settled in a bustling city, a life filled with the gentle hum of urban routine and the secure promise of a future with her fiancé. Every morning had greeted her with the familiar comfort of routine, and evenings were spent in the warm glow of shared dreams. Yet one ordinary afternoon, as she sifted through her mail, her eyes fell upon an envelope that seemed to shimmer with an urgency all its own. The envelope, delicate and cream-colored, was addressed in a neat, looping hand that she instantly recognized as belonging to her dear aunt. Its arrival was unexpected. She had not heard from her aunt for some time, and the quiet peace of her daily life was suddenly pierced by a note of distress. With a mix of trepidation and compassion, she carefully broke the seal, unfolding the letter with a trembling sense of anticipation. The letter itself was written in warm, flowing prose. It began with words of affection, a reminder of the bond they had shared since childhood, and soon turned to reveal a more alarming note. Her aunt explained that she was feeling increasingly unwell and, though reluctant to alarm her, implored her to come at once. There was an earnestness in the words that could not be ignored. The aunt's situation, painted in such delicate hues of vulnerability, was a call for help, too sincere to dismiss. In that moment, the girl felt a profound obligation to answer the call, a pull that outweighed any hesitation. She showed the letter to her fiancé, who, though initially surprised by the sudden request, readily agreed that family must come first. Together they began to prepare for a journey back to the quiet countryside, a stark contrast to the city's relentless pace. As they packed their few belongings, the girl couldn't help but marvel at the strange twist of fate. A letter born on the wings of familial love would soon lead her away from a life she had known so well, and into a world brimming with both hope and uncertainty. The journey to her aunt's home was filled with a bitter-sweet blend of anticipation and quiet foreboding. They travelled through winding country lanes, where the landscape was a patchwork of golden fields and whispering woodlands. The gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of birds seemed to echo the steady beat of her anxious heart. Every mile brought a new mixture of nostalgia and curiosity about what awaited her on the other side of the horizon. Upon arrival, the girl was greeted by a sprawling manor house that exuded a timeless charm. Ivy clung lovingly to its stone facade, and the garden was a riot of colours from carefully tended flowers, a scene that suggested both care and a hidden history. The front door swung open with a creak, and there stood her aunt, looking frail, yet determined. Her eyes, though tired, shone with a tenderness that instantly soothed the girl's worries. The reunion was heartfelt, the kind of embrace that spoke of deep, familial ties and long-forgotten childhood comforts. Inside the house, the atmosphere was warm, though tinged with an air of mystery. Alongside her aunt was another young girl, the aunt's daughter, whose bright eyes and graceful manner seemed to mirror the legacy of the family. Yet there was also a lady present, introduced as a dear friend of the family. This woman carried herself with an elegance that bordered on formality, and though she smiled politely, her manner left the girl with a vague impression of distance. There was something in the friend's measured words, and the precise way she arranged every object in the sitting-room that hinted at a careful control over every detail of the household. For a time, the days passed in a blend of reunion and routine. The girl tried to immerse herself in the comfort of her aunt's company and the familiarity of family life. Yet beneath the surface, subtle tensions began to emerge. There were quiet moments when the girl caught a fleeting look between her fiancé and her cousin, a glance filled with unspoken understanding that made her heart flutter with a confusing mixture of doubt and sorrow. Still in that early stage of her stay, the emotional wounds were not yet deep, and she clung to the hope that the invitation had been issued purely out of love and necessity. As twilight fell on her first day in the countryside, the girl sat by a window, the soft lamplight dancing on her thoughtful face. The unexpected invitation had drawn her away from everything familiar, and though her heart was heavy with the unknown, it was also filled with a tender hope. In that quiet moment, she resolved to embrace every part of this journey, even if the undercurrents of doubt were only just beginning to whisper their secrets in the stillness of the evening. Chapter 5. The Fateful Breakfast. Days passed in a quiet, simmering tension at the aunt's home. Every smile and gesture seemed edged with an unspoken strain that the girl could not ignore. She began to notice with growing disquiet the openness with which her fiancé and her cousin interacted. Their glances, the subtle touches of hands, and the ease with which they confided in one another were at odds with the gentle, trusting nature she had known all her life. Each passing moment deepened her sense of isolation and betrayal, as if a silent conspiracy were unfolding right before her eyes. That fateful night, while the household was hushed in the gentle embrace of evening, the truth revealed itself in a way too painful to dismiss. The girl found herself wandering near the drawing-room, seeking solace in the quiet corners of the grand old house. There, illuminated by the flickering light of a solitary lamp, she witnessed a scene that shattered her already fragile heart. In the shadowed alcove, her fiancé and her cousin stood close, their conversation laced with an intimacy that made her blood run cold. Their postures spoke volumes, a closeness that left no room for the innocence of mere friendship. It was a sight she never imagined she would have to endure, and in that moment the warmth of her world turned into a bitter chill. The next morning, with the first light of dawn barely brushing the horizon, she mustered the courage to confront the painful reality. With trembling hands and a heavy heart, she gathered the small token of their past, a ring that had once symbolized hope and a future intertwined with love. In a quiet, sorrowful exchange, she returned the ring to her fiancé. His acceptance was wordless, marked only by a distant, resigned gaze before he silently left, disappearing down the long, winding road. His departure left her in a solitude that felt as if it were the closing of a cherished chapter. In the days that followed, a desperate longing to reclaim some semblance of normalcy took hold of her. Despite the sting of betrayal and the ache of a broken engagement, her affection for her dear aunt and cousin remained undiminished. They were, after all, the very heart of her family, figures of warmth and care who had nurtured her through her life's many seasons. With a determination born of both love and the need to mend what had been torn asunder, she resolved to prepare a modest breakfast, a small, hopeful gesture meant to bridge the growing chasm between them. That morning, the household was touched by the soft glow of dawn filtering through the kitchen window. The girl rose early, her mind a tangle of sorrow and determination. She set about her work in the quiet kitchen, methodically preparing the meal with the precision of someone who had long practiced the art of domestic care. Toast was carefully browned, eggs were whisked to a delicate fluff, and a colourful medley of seasonal fruits was arranged artfully on a porcelain plate. Each dish was imbued with the silent hope that the simple act of sharing a meal might restore the bonds that had begun to fray. With every detail attended to, she laid the table in the dining room with quiet care, arranging the cutlery and crockery in a manner that reflected both her affection and her lingering sorrow. The table, set with modest elegance, stood as a testament to her desire to reclaim the ordinary from the midst of extraordinary hurt. She called her aunt and cousin to the table, and for a moment the house seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. They sat down with trusting smiles, their faces radiating warmth, and together they began to savour the breakfast. However, as the meal progressed and the last sips of tea were taken, an unsettling stillness descended. It was first noticed in the faint tremor of her aunt's hand and the sudden loss of colour in her cousin's cheeks. Within moments, both had become alarmingly unwell, their expressions, once relaxed and kind, contorted into masks of shock and distress. Panic seized the girl's heart as she hurried to their side, her mind racing to comprehend the abrupt reversal of fortune. Before she could call out in alarm, the sound of hurried footsteps and the stern voices of the police shattered the fragile calm. In what felt like mere moments, the cosy intimacy of that morning was overwhelmed by chaos. The authorities swarmed in, their faces set in grim determination, and in the ensuing confusion she found herself at the centre of a nightmare that defied reason. Standing amidst the turmoil, the girl maintained her steadfast protest. She had not added a single drop of poison to the food. Yet suspicion clung to her like a shroud as the scene descended into accusations and whispered conjectures. The breakfast, once a simple act of familial care, had transformed into the tragic fulcrum upon which her entire world now teetered. A world irrevocably altered by a single fateful meal. Chapter 6. Whispers and Red Herrings. After the turbulent events of that dreadful morning, Miss Marple resolved to peel back the layers of deception that had so cruelly ensnared the young girl. With quiet determination, she returned to the ancestral home where whispers of betrayal still lingered in the corridors. There, amid faded portraits and muted memories, she hoped to uncover more clues from those who remained, especially the woman introduced as the dear friend of the late Mrs. Carter. Miss Marple found this so-called friend in the drawing-room, seated elegantly by a lace-curtained window, meticulously embroidering a delicate pattern on fine fabric. Her movements were precise and deliberate, yet there was an air of rehearsed calm that made Miss Marple's experienced eyes narrow ever so slightly. "Madam," Miss Marple began in her soft, measured tone, "might you spare a few moments to discuss your relationship with the late Mrs. Carter?" The woman looked up, a polite smile gracing her lips as if she were accustomed to being questioned about family matters. "Of course, Miss Marple," she replied, her voice smooth, yet carrying an undercurrent of something harder to decipher. "I have known Mrs. Carter for many years. We were not merely friends, but kindred spirits in many respects. I regarded her as family, yet, as the conversation unfolded, Miss Marple detected subtle inconsistencies. When the topic turned to the distressing events that had recently shattered their lives, the friend's tone faltered. In a barely perceptible whisper, she confided, "After my own heart was so cruelly broken by a man unworthy of affection, I sometimes felt as though I could allow nothing and no one to stand in my way. There were moments, regrettably, when my thoughts darkened, but I quickly chastised them." Her confession, though quickly veiled in contrition, left a lingering impression of suppressed bitterness. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as ever, made a note. Genuine grief seldom came mixed with a trace of vindictive resolve. Unsatisfied with mere impressions, Miss Marple sought further insight from another trusted source, the kindly doctor. Hargreaves. In his modest consulting room, the doctor recalled his interactions with the girl during her brief visits to the clinic. "Indeed, I did notice a shadow of melancholy when her engagement dissolved," he admitted, stirring his tea absent-mindedly. "But that was a natural, transient sorrow. In time, her innate warmth and gentle nature returned. I find it utterly inconceivable that such a delicate soul would commit an act as grievous as poisoning her beloved aunt." His words reinforced the notion that the girl was a victim of circumstances rather than a cold-blooded perpetrator. Still, a nagging doubt persisted in Miss Marple's mind regarding the mysterious friend. She next paid a visit to Mrs. McGregor, the long-time household maid, whose unpretentious manner and keen observations had long served as the unsung backbone of the estate. Over a modest cup of tea in the kitchen, Mrs. McGregor explained earnestly, "The girl has been the very embodiment of kindness and care ever since she arrived. I have never seen her so filled with love for Mrs. Carter. She treats her with the utmost respect and affection. It is as if she were born to be her companion." The maid's firm conviction lent further credence to the girl's innocence, and cast a darker light on the friend's dubious character. Armed with these varied insights, Miss Marple began to piece together the puzzle. The friend's revealed bitterness over personal heartbreak, her carefully measured yet oddly cold admission of darker thoughts, and her insistence on a closeness to Mrs. Carter that the other witnesses did not confirm. All these factors wove a picture of a woman whose true motivations were shrouded in misdirection. While the girl's sorrow was real and deeply felt, the friend's narrative was punctuated with red herrings that hinted at an ulterior, more sinister design. The turning point came unexpectedly when Miss Marple revisited the invitation letter that had summoned the girl to the estate. Sitting in the quiet study, she held the letter delicately and studied the elegant, flowing script. Almost imperceptibly, she recognized the distinctive style of the handwriting. It bore an uncanny resemblance to that of the friend. "How very curious," she murmured to herself. "The very pen that penned this invitation seems to match the handwriting I have seen in some of her personal notes." This subtle yet undeniable clue confirmed her growing suspicion. The woman presented as a friend was in fact a distant relative of Mrs. Carter, a fact cleverly concealed to serve her own dark purposes. With every whispered suspicion and every red herring now coming together, Miss Marple felt the murk of deception begin to clear. The friendly veneer, once taken at face value, was now stripped away to reveal ambition, bitterness, and a meticulously crafted plan. The threads of motive, betrayal, personal grief, and a covetous hunger for inheritance were now tightly interwoven, guiding her ever closer to the truth behind the tragic events. Chapter 7. Threads of Suspicion. In the quiet aftermath of her earlier inquiries, Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to the details that had so subtly hinted at deception. Over a late morning cup of tea in her cosy sitting-room, she retrieved the invitation letter that had summoned the young girl to her aunt's home. The elegant, looping script, once taken at face value, now seemed to whisper secrets of its own. As she held the letter up to the light, Miss Marple's keen eyes noted that the style of handwriting bore an uncanny resemblance to that of the mysterious friend of the deceased aunt. It was as if the same careful pen had both extended the invitation and perhaps sown the seeds of a darker plan. Her mind wandered back to her earlier conversations. Dr. Hargreaves had spoken warmly of the girl's innate kindness, while the long-serving maid, Mrs. McGregor, had testified to the young woman's gentle nature. In contrast, the friend's manner had been measured and oddly detached, a veneer that now seemed more like a mask, concealing true intent. Determined to get to the bottom of this discrepancy, Miss Marple resolved to probe deeper into the friend's background. Stepping out into the cool, crisp air, Miss Marple made her way to the local parish records office. The building, as old and dignified as the village itself, was a treasure trove of information on its residents. Here, she hoped, the truth of the friend's identity might be revealed. In a quiet corner of the office, among yellowed ledgers and faded registers, she discovered entries pertaining to the late Mrs. Carter's family. To her increasing surprise, one name recurred, a name that belonged not to a lifelong friend, but to a distant relative with a rather obscure connection to the family estate. The records indicated that the friend, Miss Evelyn Harper, was indeed related to Mrs. Carter, though the connection had long been obscured by time and a deliberate effort to conceal the truth. Miss Marple recalled that during her earlier visit to the manor, Miss Harper had introduced herself as a dear friend, never once mentioning her true lineage. Now, with the evidence from the parish records before her, Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. Could it be that Miss Harper had deliberately misrepresented herself in order to get closer to the family, and ultimately to profit from their misfortune? Armed with this newfound knowledge, Miss Marple returned to the village with quiet resolve. She made a discreet inquiry with a local historian, a man known for his encyclopedic knowledge of the village's past. Over a modest lunch in the village cafe, the historian confirmed that Miss Harper's family had once held a share in the considerable wealth of the Carter estate. However, as time passed, those claims had faded into obscurity, until a recent change in circumstances brought them back into focus. There were whispers, the historian confided in a low voice, of a relative who might stand to gain greatly from the passing of Mrs. Carter. It was all very hush-hush, but it did set tongues wagging. These words resonated with Miss Marple. She began to see the threads of ambition interwoven with bitterness in Miss Harper's character. The elegant handwriting of the invitation letter was not an innocent flourish, but a deliberate act of misdirection. With the script matching samples from personal letters attributed to Miss Harper, the evidence now pointed towards a carefully crafted plan. The invitation had been a lure, a means to ensure that the girl, unwittingly, set foot into a trap from which she would be blamed for a crime she did not commit. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motive. If Miss Harper was indeed a relative, she might have seen an opportunity to secure a portion of the Carter inheritance. The recent break-up between the girl and her fiancé, combined with the emotional turmoil that had followed, had left the young woman vulnerable. It was a vulnerability that someone with cunning and a desperate hunger for wealth could exploit. Each detail, the precise choice of words in the letter, the subtly cold demeanour of Miss Harper when questioned, the careful concealment of her true identity, formed a pattern that Miss Marple could not ignore. In the solitude of her study that evening, with the lamp's soft glow illuminating her thoughtful face, Miss Marple meticulously reviewed all the gathered clues. The handwriting analysis, the parish records, the historian's whispered account, and the conflicting testimonies from those who had known the family. All these pieces were slowly fitting together. They painted a picture of a woman who had concealed her familial ties and harboured ambitions that far exceeded the boundaries of mere friendship. Though the case was far from solved, Miss Marple felt certain that she was now on the verge of a breakthrough. The threads of suspicion were beginning to converge, and the hidden motives behind the tragic events were becoming ever more apparent. With quiet determination, she resolved to gather the remaining evidence that would finally expose the true nature of Miss Harper's involvement, a discovery that once made would cast the long shadow of deceit into the light of day. Chapter 8. The Truth Unveiled. The crisp autumn air carried the final promise of resolution as Miss Marple stepped into the drawing-room of the Carter estate. In the quiet, dignified space, where sunlight filtered through stained glass and danced upon polished wood, a tense congregation awaited her arrival. A small contingent of local police, alerted by Miss Marple's discreet inquiries, sat in attentive silence. At the centre of the unfolding drama stood Miss Evelyn Harper, the woman who had so long masqueraded as a dear friend, but whose true identity as a distant relative of Mrs. Carter had now come under scrutiny. Miss Marple's calm presence, coupled with the weight of the evidence gathered, lent an air of inevitability to the proceedings. With measured steps and her trademark gentle smile, she addressed the assembled figures. "Madam Harper," she began, her voice soft yet unwavering, "I believe we are all gathered here today in pursuit of truth, a truth that has been concealed behind false pretenses and misdirected affections for far too long." Miss Harper's face, once composed and demure, faltered slightly at Miss Marple's direct gaze. The doctor's earlier account of the girl's innocence, combined with testimonies from Mrs. McGregor and a local historian, had painted a picture of a vulnerable soul exploited by a cunning manipulator. Miss Marple continued, "It has come to my attention that the invitation letter you so elegantly penned, a letter meant to draw our young guest to this very house, bears the unmistakable traits of your own handwriting, not that of her aunt. This discovery, corroborated by parish records, reveals that you are not the loyal friend you claim to be, but a relative whose intentions were far more self-serving." A murmur of disbelief passed among the onlookers, but Miss Harper's eyes remained fixed on the floor. The silence was broken only by the soft tapping of a clock, each tick echoing the slow unravelling of her carefully constructed deceit. "Furthermore," Miss Marple pressed on, "we have uncovered evidence that you, Madam Harper, harboured a deep-seated bitterness, stemming from personal heartbreak, that clouded your judgment and led you down a most grievous path. It appears you sought not only to secure the considerable wealth of Mrs. Carter, but to cast blame upon an innocent girl, one who cared for her with genuine affection and loyalty. The poison discovered in your possession, hidden in a bag of personal effects, serves as the final and most damning piece of evidence against you." The room fell into an even deeper hush as the police officer stepped forward to confirm that the incriminating substance had indeed been recovered from Miss Harper's belongings. "The evidence, when taken together with the false identity you assumed and the meticulous manner in which you orchestrated events, left little room for denial." Miss Harper's eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and rage as she realized the net had tightened beyond escape. In a voice that quavered with both indignation and despair, she finally admitted, "Yes, I admit it. My plan was to secure the fortune that rightfully belonged to my family. I orchestrated the events so that the girl would be blamed for the untimely demise of her aunt and cousin. I never imagined I would be caught, but the threads of deceit, once pulled by a keen observer, unravelled with such ease. A collective sigh of relief passed through the room, as the truth, at last, had been laid bare. The local police promptly took Miss Harper into custody, ensuring that she would face justice for her actions. The silence that followed was heavy with both sorrow for the victims and a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. In the days that followed, the local community slowly began to heal from the shock of the revelations. The young girl, long burdened with the weight of false accusations, was exonerated and released from jail. Her name, once tarnished by suspicion, was finally cleared. The truth of her innocence spread swiftly, restoring her standing in the eyes of those who had once doubted her character. Not long after these events, the girl found solace in the steadfast kindness of Dr. Hargreaves. Their bond, forged in the crucible of hardship and nurtured by shared compassion, blossomed into a heartfelt romance. In time, they were married in a modest ceremony, a celebration of hope and renewal in the wake of past misfortunes. True to her nature, Miss Marple was honoured with an invitation to the wedding, a final, gentle reminder that in the end, truth and justice, much like the soft light of dawn, always prevail. Thus, with a keen eye for detail and an unwavering commitment to justice, Miss Marple had once again brought to light the hidden machinations of human frailty and ambition, restoring peace to the troubled hearts of St. Mary Mead.